That is yours. Thank you. Hiya. For anyone who's been here for a few events, I'm just going to introduce myself again. Hi, I'm Myri. I run Lighthouse, Edinburgh's Radical Bookshop. Thank you for being at the Radical Book Fair for our final sort of slice of the afternoon. I'm going to briefly introduce our terrific chair for this event, and then they are going to introduce our panel. I'd like to ask anyone who's having a wee wander around the fair and enjoying the space, do stick around, have a browse, but be conscious that our audience up at the front will end up in sensory overload if they have competing noises from across the room. So to just keep the volume down in the back half. And we have the snug downstairs. So if you want to have a chat and hang out, there is somewhere to do that. So to Nish. Nish Doshi is a community builder, researcher, facilitator, and dreamer who focuses on building cultures of care. With over 15 years of experience in grassroots organizing, they currently work across the intersections of disability justice, tech justice, and the ongoing work of cultivating self-compassion. Currently, you may find them meandering through trees, curled up under electric blankets, or cooking up a storm. Will you join me in welcoming Nish Doshi and our panel for this afternoon?
Hello, welcome. I hope you managed to get here quite safely. We're really privileged to have both Leah and Gracie here. So Leah Cowan is a writer and editor. She's a former politics editor at gal-dem, an online magazine and media platform run by women and non-binary people of colour. Leah also works at Project 17, at an advice centre for migrant families who have no recourse to public funds and are facing homelessness and destitution. Her first book, Border Nation, A Story of Migration, was published in 2021 by Pluto Press, and her second title, right here, Why Would Feminists Trust the Police, was published in June 2024 by Verso. Gracie May Bradley is a writer, policy expert, and campaign concerned with what it means for people to live flourishing lives. She's particularly interested in civil liberties, state power, tech surveillance, Black feminism, and abolition. She's a co-author of Against Borders, also here, and is currently working on a novel. So please welcome them to... To kind of start off, let's start off with a really big question, which is, what does abolition mean to you?
I can jump in. So there was a project that I was working on recently with the group Abolitionist Futures, and we put together a resource which was looking at creating a wall chart, basically mapping out different approaches to addressing gender-based violence. And we looked at what are some of the reformist approaches that we think are, not really going to solve the root issues that we're dealing with here, and what are the abolitionist approaches that want to pull these issues up by their roots and really kind of grapple with them. And as part of that process, we came up with a summary of abolition and how it really works for us as being both a political vision and a practical project. And both of those pieces being interlinked and weaving into each other and having to work together. So it's not just that you have the vision and the thinking and the blue sky dreaming over here, and then kind of practical work happening over there. It's the political vision that really underpins and ties together the day-to-day survival work that we're doing to try and build this future in the here and now that's based on care and compassion rather than punishment and vengeance and competition and all of the things that neoliberalism encourages us to think are inevitable. And it is this two-pronged thing of both building and dismantling, and I think it's Ruth Wilson Gilmore talks about abolition as both absence and presence. So the ways in which we need to build life-affirming institutions so that we can live and thrive and survive, and at the same time dismantle the things that oppress and cage us and get rid of the structures that make our lives really hard and place many people in a situation of walking death. So it's that balance, that two-pronged thing of the building and the dismantling. That's really what abolition means to me.
To build on that, I suppose I completely agree with this idea of abolition as presence and not absence. I think in the afterword to Border Abolition Now, I kind of borrowed a phrase from Sivanandan talking about abolition as thinking in order to do. And when we think about like what abolition is doing, or what the abolitionist horizon or vision is, it's a world in which institutions like prisons and immigration detention centres and practices of bordering and policing are not just absent, but they're also obsolete. So it's not just about getting rid of those things, which we recognise as causing enormous harm to many, many people. It's about changing the world so that the conditions to which they are a response are transformed. You know, we're thinking, what does a world look like in which we don't need the prison system that we have today? What does the world look like that doesn't need or rely on violent bordering practices? So, for me, abolition is thinking in order to do, but at its heart, it's really kind of pushing against this politics of disposability, like this idea that some people just aren't worth it and can be caged or warehoused and have time stolen from them, their ability to live a flourishing life stolen from them. And so I suppose what really drew me to abolition specifically was also its call that we transform the relations between us. So it's not, I'd done a lot of work with kind of, I don't know, like anarchist men who were going, smash the state, which is fine, like, yes, fine, smash the state, but who were kind of completely unwilling to deal with what would need to happen in our personal relationships for us to have like a flourishing society if we did smash the state. That kind of call for personal transformation, that call for us to figure out how to deal with conflict without being like, I'm just locking you up and forgetting about you. That ability to think about how we're going to deal with harm, because we do harm one another, without saying, I'm just going to warehouse you and you can just stay there forever and come out pretty much the same. That, to me, is the core of abolition.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that point about abolition being both about the thing that we're moving towards and the goal and the vision, but also abolition being the way that we get there, as you say, like transforming the way that we think and relate to ourselves and to the earth and to each other through the process of doing the organising and getting to this horizon, which we will never actually touch, right? It's a kind of ongoing, motion.
I think both of you kind of highlight the sort of, within that disposability, how institutions have built these sort of, like the legacies of colonialism, the legacies of like the world, like capitalism, the whole structures and how these institutions, which are quite old, have filtered in and kind of shaped how we think about things, and also how those specific institutions have prevented and diverting, have diverted us from moving towards liberation. But you also, and this is really beautiful that both of you do this, is you spotlight opportunities for transformation and movement towards liberation. I think in Against Borders, Gracie, you speak about non-reformist reforms, which I love the phrasing of, because most of the time when we're firefighting, we're sort of stuck in this sort of, we just need to save ourselves right now, and kind of focusing on we need to save ourselves now for the future is a really beautiful way of looking at things. And also, I think Leah, just your book is just so rich in terms of the legacies, and you build on the storytelling of how we got to where we are right now. And I really love that. And I was wondering if you could share more about where you think there are opportunities for resistance and movements towards abolition in this current period of fascism.
Yeah, I suppose maybe I'll just take it back a step and talk a little bit about non-reformist reforms and that framework, because this is a specific framework that came from a particular time, and Luke and I talk about it in the book. You know, Andrea Gortz was writing in the US at a time where the economic situation was dire, union power was really, really weak, and a kind of revolution didn't really seem like it was on the cards, and yet things still needed to change. And I think it's Angela Davis who says that, like, there's no abolitionist who thinks that nothing needs to change right now. Like, all abolitionists want something to change today or tomorrow. Like, we're not only looking at this really, really long horizon, we're looking at what we do now that gets us there. In Border Abolition Now, there's a really interesting essay by Brian Whitener who sort of says, maybe we don't need non-reformist reforms in this moment. And he's thinking particularly in the United States, he's looking at like the militancy of the Black Lives Matter movement and the breadth of the uprisings and kind of the scale of the social change there that's being demanded. And he's saying, well, this is a slightly different context to the context of André Gortz and the time in which he wrote about non-reformist reforms. And this isn't a framework that necessarily is going to hold in all times and places. And looking at the militancy on the ground in the US, like maybe there's room for something different. Like maybe we can shoot for something different. I don't think that that's where we are in the UK, but I suppose like for me, the core of non-reformist reforms they're kind of those changes that we call for in the here and now that will open the way to an abolitionist horizon. So like sometimes you call for changes that are just going to strengthen the system that you're trying to dismantle. So, you know, when the Black Lives Matter uprisings happened here in the UK, I was at Liberty then. So I was like speaking behind the scenes to some younger organisers who were doing interesting radical things. And they were going, what about unconscious bias training for judges? And I was not obviously, but I was kind of like, A, I think judges have had unconscious bias training. B, that's just going to pour more resources into the judicial system. And there's very little evidence that unconscious bias training is actually going to lead to fewer, you know, black and working class people being incarcerated. If there was an evidence base that it worked, I'd say, yeah, great, but actually a lot of the training initiatives just strengthen the system. There's very little evidence that they're going to make a real difference to the kinds of changes that we want to secure. So I talked to them about, I said, well, what if, for example, you campaigned around getting rid of suspicionless stop and search? Because that's a power that is well evidenced to be massively racially disproportionate. It's not particularly successful in fighting crime. Like, the police find less stuff when they do suspicionless stop and search than when they do suspicion-based stop and search. And in 2014, even Theresa May was saying, this needs to be reformed. Like, that's a power that, you know, there's been wiggle room on in the relatively recent history, and it's taking power away from the police. That would be an example of a non-reformist reform. So I think sometimes we talk about abolition, sometimes it can be kind of collapsed into non-reformist reforms, and it's a lot more than that. And that's why I talk about Brian Whitener's work, because there are abolitionists working in some contexts where non-reformist reforms like just might not be the best framework to be working through. But I think especially for those of us that have been in kind of more formalized institutions that maybe aren't explicitly abolitionist, but that might still be working to some kind of horizon, that are working for change in the here and now, non-reformist reforms are a useful framework, and they're something that can happen maybe tomorrow, maybe in 3 years' time, something that we might see in our lifetimes that make more change possible. So I know that I didn't speak specifically to your question, but I think it's useful background.
Yeah, very useful. Thank you.
When I read Against Borders, I was so glad that you spoke about non-reformist reforms, because I tried to write about it in my book and it got cut because the editor was like, it's a bit boring. Maybe it was the way I was talking about it. But I think it's a really important framework, and the way I explained it in the now buried draft of that chapter that doesn't exist, the way that André Gortz explains it is that you're thinking about what are the changes that we can make, where are the opportunities to make those changes that would restrict the power of the state and increase the power of the people. And that's the kind of matrix that we need to be using to evaluate demands and requests and campaigns. You know, we should be looking at them through this lens of, does this thing that we're asking for potentially limit the power of the state, and does it increase the power of the people? And particularly thinking around things like gender-based violence, which my book focuses on a lot. The women's sector or domestic violence sector or gender-based violence sector, however you want to name it, in the UK a lot of the demands that come out of that space are around criminalising XYZ form of gender-based violence. And through a non-reformist reform lens, if we ask those same questions of, does this thing restrict the power of the state? No, it absolutely doesn't, because it's giving more power to the state to surveil, harass, brutalise, incarcerate people. It's given more power to the state to say, we need more money funneled into the criminal legal system and into policing and into prisons and probation, because now we've got all this extra work to do. And does it increase the power of the people? No, it doesn't. It gives us this impression that we can't look after each other. We can't care for each other. We can't prevent harm or reduce harm in our communities and in our society, and we have to look to the state to do that. So that's just kind of one example of how I think that framing of non-reformist reform is really useful when we're thinking about our organising and the things that we're organising around. In terms of your question around opportunities for resistance, I think one of the things that gives me a lot of hope is the structures and the struggles that we're going through and that we're up against are massive. But that also means that our strategies and our resistance are myriad and massive and multiple as well. They're these kind of interlocking tapestries of different ways that we can chip away at the various harms that we're facing in society, whether that's the hostile environment or the criminal legal system or the border regime. And that's really inspiring. There's a particular document called the UK Border Regime, A Critical Guide, that was published by Corporate Watch in 2018. And obviously, immigration law changes every 5 minutes. So something written in 2018, some parts of it are a bit out of date, but there's a really useful section on this question of like strategy and resistance and pushback and opportunity. And they have this framework where they talk about finding, this is particularly focusing on the border regime, right? Like finding the weak points in the border. How can we identify the financial, cultural, institutional, societal limits on actually what the border regime can actually do? An example of that potentially being what happened in 2021 in Kenmure Street in Glasgow, when a border van went in to try and detain 2 men, and the whole community came out, neighbours came out, local organising groups came out and said, absolutely not, is this happening in our street? And that, while sometimes the kind of social, cultural norms, attitude, the limits of those are perhaps much, the kind of tolerance of those limits are much higher than we might want them to be, that was a really good example of, okay, they actually hit a limit there where the people in that street were like, no, this is a red line for us, we're not going to stand for that. And so in this guide, they kind of talk through the different ways. Maybe it's a financial limitation, so every time a border van comes into our communities, they can't send 100 border guards to match up with the 100 people that might come out to support those people. So there are financial and operational limits on the border. And thinking through it in this way, the guide then talks about how do we turn these weak points into openings. So how do we take these small, local level wins or victories or moments of solidarity and grow and expand them? And they use this metaphor of like a piece of fabric or a curtain. And they talk about little tears and openings in the curtain. And maybe you have a tear here and a tear there. And then maybe those tears join up and you get a bigger hole and the light starts to filter through. So they have this really useful way, I think, of thinking about, yes, we don't have a one-size-fits-all solution that's just going to sort everything, but we can leverage these little openings, these limitations, these weak points. We can leverage this tapestry of resistance that we're building and start to really expand those openings.
Would you like to add anything?
I suppose I'm just thinking specifically about Scotland. I've lived here for 3 years. I'm in Glasgow, but I worked in Edinburgh for a year. And I suppose one of the things that I find quite interesting about the Central Belt, at least, is, and Glasgow, I guess, specifically, kind of the building of, I suppose, infrastructures of care. Basically, there are lots of people doing interesting things about how to be together and live together that are often quite place-based, kind of community food growing initiatives, or, the renters union. And, these aren't these aren't, groups or initiatives that explicitly would badge themselves as abolitionist. And I think often, like, my experience in Scotland is that, like, there isn't huge awareness of kind of abolition as a framework. So I wouldn't try and sort of reverse engineer them in that way. But if we think about abolition as basically trying to change society so that some of these carceral structures are obsolete, and so that we have ways of being together and caring for one another that are less reliant on a state that is, unreliable and harmful for some people, then I think that there are really interesting abolitionist seeds in a lot of those initiatives. And they're kind of very, from what I've seen, like really, really low-key, like not hugely public-facing in a way, like not necessarily shouting about what they're doing. But that's quite different to places that I've lived in before. And I think that there's room there for kind of, I think that's how abolition takes hold. And, you have to have room to have conversations with people and relationships with people. So I think that there's interesting ground, at least in the central belt of Scotland, that, maybe is not there in other places. And I suppose the other kind of organising that I know in Scotland is to do with climate. And I was saying to these two earlier that, I was often very frustrated in that work in Scotland because there wasn't really any analysis of the state. There was kind of just this idea of, we'll just have a good enough state and it will do the right climate policies that we've suggested and then the climate crisis will be fine. But, if you read Rehearsals for Living, or if you read any of Ruthie Gilmore's work, like Ruth Wilson Gilmore in particular has done so much work on how bad carceral institutions are for the environment, how terrible for the environment prisons are, the military-industrial complex, etc. And I think, again, if like some work is done in the climate sector in Scotland, which, is pretty well-resourced and pretty vibrant, then there's room there for a conversation about why are we spending money on X when actually we need to be, sorting out our buses, not an issue in Edinburgh, more of an issue in Glasgow. Like, there's that kind of conversation that could be had if people wanted to start it.
I'm sorry, I'm just trying to think through. You've just made me think a lot, so I'll kind of move on to the next question because otherwise I'll ponder too much. I really love the phrasing of abolition as abundance, not absence, that you use, Leah, and I also it's such an opening for imagining a world which nourishes us rather than punishes us. And I think, Gracie, you're working on a novel. I don't know if it's related at all, but I guess what examples of fiction or building and dreaming work have inspired you recently? Or
I think, I'm thinking a lot about this idea of imagination, where I kind of move towards in the end of my book is thinking about the shrinkage of the feminist imagination that happens within a context of neoliberalism. And one of the kind of theories that I'm pulling through, one of the threads I'm pulling through in the book is the formalization of the women's sector or the domestic violence sector is very much in step with neoliberalism and the restriction of funding and how that shrinks our ability to think through what does justice actually look like and have a really capacious idea of what justice looks like, as well as what harm looks like, and that really expanding the categories of the things that we're willing to consider harm or that the women's sector is willing to consider harm. And in relation with this idea of imagination and dreaming, I'm trying to think through, for personal reasons, what rest looks like. How do we rest, and why is rest so necessary? And I think there was something that I used to really struggle with, particularly, I guess, perhaps working in a charity sector, working in a place where the idea is that you take your annual leave so that you can rest and then get better to be more productive and come back to work and do the average thing that you're doing and continue to do it. And I was listening to a talk by the US poet and activist Tricia Hersey, who thinks a lot about rest and sleeping and naps in a very kind of politicized way. And she talks about rest being necessary, not because then you can refuel yourself and go back into the office, or refuel yourself and go back to your 0 hours precarious job and continue doing it, but so that we can create space to dream of the alternatives, to think of the alternatives to the things that we're doing that are making our lives really hard and that are draining us and that are killing many and some of us. And Trisha Hersey also talks about how capitalism creates the idea of the impossible. So it creates these boundaries and restrictions around what we think we can actually do, whether that's as individuals, whether that's as collectives, whether that's, with our neighbours. And I've already talked about some examples of actually the many things that we can do together if we allow ourselves to step into that. And I think it's really linked to this particularly Thatcherite neoliberal idea of life is tough and you just have to grit your teeth and get on with it, and there being something kind of morally good about just having a hard time and getting on with it anyway. And I think rest and dreaming and imagination really pushes back against that and says there's so much more that we can imagine for ourselves and each other, and it's really important to create the space to do that. In terms of you asked for examples of things that I've read, which I've so far dodged and procrastinated around. Gracie and Luke's book have really useful creative sections where there's a kind of dystopian fictional piece, and not necessarily a utopian fictional piece, but an abolitionist fictional piece where there's a thinking through of what would a different way of doing things look like, and I really encourage you to go and read those interludes. The writer and thinker Lola Olufemi has an amazing book called Experiments in Imagining Otherwise, where similarly Lola puts together these fragments of poetry and prose, and they're very much thinking through ideas about little vignettes and glimpses of what could a different thing look like. And one TV series that actually I found, I don't know if it was disheartening or useful or maybe a bit of both, the series Severance. I don't know if anybody watched it. Came out 2 years ago, directed by Ben Stiller, which might make you think, is this going to be weird and bad? But it's a sci-fi, psychological thriller that has this very slightly dubious premise that you can have this medical intervention where you have a chip planted in your brain and it's spatially activated. So when you walk into your workplace, one part of your brain switches on and you are the person at work and you have no knowledge of yourself outside of work. And then when you step outside of the office, this chip kind of switches something in your brain and you have no knowledge of what you've done in the office, and you only have your outside of the office life. You have your innie and your outie that represent these two spaces. And as the viewer, we see the characters moving between the office and the outside world. And the thing they're doing in the office is sitting at a screen and sorting numbers into boxes, depending on how scared they are of the number. It's a kind of an arbitrary, that 2 is quite scary, so I'm going to sort it there. And they have different targets to meet. And it is just this kind of meditation, I guess, on work and capitalism and the kind of horror of it all, but also quite an accurate representation of working for a charity in a policy space and just being we've got the numbers in the boxes, we've won this policy tweak that we can report back to our funder, but then you step outside of the office and you're what was I doing? I don't really understand that. I find dystopian fiction really useful for the same reason that it's really useful in Gracie's book, because it kind of gives us this cautionary tale, perhaps, of things that are happening right now, actually, in different ways, and things that we're moving towards, and the urgency of making sure that we don't continue down this path. So that's my recommendation. You can probably illegally watch it somewhere if you don't want to get Apple TV.
You just made me think, Leah, of the part in your book where you talk about the difference in attitudes, perhaps generationally, between sort of people of our generation working in the women's sector and kind of that attitude to work where the job is a job and it doesn't necessarily contain everything that I want to do with my life and my time, and kind of a previous generation that maybe came into the sector when it wasn't a sector and they weren't paid and have this very different relationship to the work. And it's been quite interesting, as someone of our generation who's directed organisations, kind of navigating that, navigating what it means to rest and what it means to dream in those contexts. I suppose, I read all the time. Let me say a bit about, mine and Luke's book. We wrote it together for different reasons, and one of my reasons for wanting to write the book was, well, in part, it was a bit of a rebellion at the institution that I was working at, because there'd been this sort of ridiculous megalomaniacal comms director. I think all comms directors are megalomaniacal, but I think that's probably because I am as well. They would be saying the same thing about me. But who'd basically said, anything you write has to be approved by the organization. And I was just like, well, no. And so in the end, I was like, Luke, let's write a book. And then we wrote the book, and then I quit before the book came out, so I could be like, woohoo, look at the book, nothing to do with you lot. But I think it was, initially we started writing the book in the Corbyn moment, where it felt like there was some political education, there was an opportunity to do some political education, and there was an opportunity to do some pushing, basically, for stuff that we might want on comparatively favourable terrain. The book came out in 2022, after the pandemic, after kind of that Corbynite moment in the Labour movement had been pretty much decapitated. But it came out sort of into this moment where by the way, I was not really a Corbynite, but one of the ways in which he was decapitated was through this imaginative disciplining, basically through the repetition of this message, as it has been since, Thatcher, if not before, in terms of the loony left, where it's just this is pie in the sky, this can never happen, this is impossible, how dare you dream of this, how dare you think of a world that is otherwise. So, it was a book that was written in rebellion against lots of kinds of disciplining. And I think that fiction really works beautifully against that kind of disciplining. I'm not someone who necessarily is all good fiction has a political message, because I kind of think, in my vision of a utopia, we might all be making weird, pointless art, right, that doesn't have any message. That is a good thing in itself. But I think when we're trying to get out of the imaginative shackles of the mainstream media and a lot of the institutions that we work in, I think fiction, I think utopian political philosophy can really open the horizons. And I think what was really interesting when Luke and I did the book tour was that people were like, yes, great, wonderful, clever arguments against borders. Tell us about the fiction. They just wanted to talk about the fiction at the end. And that was the bit that I really, really enjoyed writing. I kind of slacked, and Luke did quite a bit of the first draft. And when he was like, what are you doing? And I was like, well, I'm directing Liberty, but fine. The bit that when I sat down and set a timer, I was like, blah, blah, blah. And what came out was the fiction bits, because that was just really, really fun. And I think it just resonates at a different, we all have an imagination. We all have really different levels of, political interest and theoretical basis and all the rest of it. But, everybody has an imagination. So I think it's a really interesting way to reach people, and to reach way more people than will, want to just read the bit of the book that is not fiction. I am working on a novel. Well, I'm kind of working on a novel. I'm doing my doctorate. But my supervisors were basically just go and do what you want for your first year. You don't have to try and write your thesis now. So what I'm working on is an extension of the dystopia in Against Borders.
That's what I was hoping.
Yes, so that's what I'm up to, because I ended up feeling really guilty about where I'd left my protagonist. I left Alberto, in a coffin, getting, he's in a coffin, crossing the ocean, he's, sedated, he has to wear an exosuit, Amazon was in my head, it's it's weird, but he's just having a really bad time. And I just started to feel guilty, and I was like, I've got to get him out of there. So that's what I have been working on. In terms of recommendations, there's a really weird book called The Employees by Olga Raven, which is about some beings on what might be a spaceship doing something with things that are their jobs are to do with rocks that are alive. It's a great book. Woman on the Edge of Time by Marge Piercy is just, do it justice. The Dispossessed by Ursula K. Le Guin and Kindred by Octavia Butler. Those are 4 books that I just love, and would encourage you to read.
Thank you. Women on the Edge of Time actually made me really think about the end of medical biomedical abolition as well. Like, it just blew my mind. I read it so many years ago, and it was just like the first time I was like, wow, we can actually imagine another world. Can I ask you a cheeky question? I didn't send you this in the sort of notes, but I wanted, just before we move to questions, do you think utopia as a concept is a useful way of talking about abolition?
Can I say something? I think part of what I really enjoyed about, and it's interesting that the one that you chose to expand was the dystopia one, right? Like, the interesting thing about the abolitionist vision that I found really useful, I think sometimes when I read things that are a bit more utopian and they're like, imagine this perfect world where everything is perfect and everything is sorted, and that's really hopeful and exciting. I think what you say explicitly about the abolitionist interlude is like, some things still don't quite work, and like there's like a solar power cell in a tree, and like maybe they put it there too high and it's kind of creaking, and the person's like, is this going to fall down? And I really enjoyed those moments where it was like, okay, so we're not talking about like a perfect thing where everything is great and nobody is harming each other and all of our decisions are wonderful, but it's like, what is good enough? What is something that is moving us towards something that is good enough? And I think, that being a shade different to utopia felt really useful to me to read.
That's interesting. Thank you. That's really interesting. I guess, like, sometimes people say utopian and mean it in a derogatory way. I'm all for reclaiming the word utopian, and just because, I just think, why can't we dream about stuff? Like, the right gets to dream about stuff and talk about it, like it's definitely going to happen and 100% feasible, and they're going to find the money for it, and the organs of the state are going to be able to implement it, and the media is going to, why do only they get to do that? I'm all for reclaiming kind of this idea of the utopian, just in terms of like the basic belief that things can be better. That's how I feel about it. Like, I just think why not? But I mean, what's underneath?
What do you
your
think?
Question?
I guess I feel like often in movements we get stuck in like dreaming up utopias and then not being able to do the work because we constantly like say, oh, it's not perfect enough. Yeah. Instead of actually just doing it and going, it's going to be imperfect, it's going to be broken, we're going to have lots of complexity. And I think that also feeds into sort of the problems of cancel culture in terms of the actual real cancel culture, of like how we then police ourselves and police our movements because we're so busy trying to build these sort of perfect images. And I think social media also plays into that. But I'm really cautious now around utopias because I'm worried about like how we are so obsessed with perfection. Yeah. And that kind of, I think actually I find beauty in imperfection as well. Mm-hmm. And I think when we're moving towards like an abolitionist future, for me it's not about building utopias, it's about stumbling through, and the sort of classic sort of journey matters as well as like the destination. Yeah,
I guess if I can come back on that, I suppose one of the things that we haven't really talked about, like, you're meeting me and Leah as writers because we're talking about our books, but I suppose like we are both people, and obviously speak for yourself, but like we've done grassroots organising, we've also been in the NGO sector, and like we've really been at the coalface of supporting people who are at the sharpest end of state power. And so I suppose like how I feel about utopia, it would be very different for me to talk about it that way, like if I hadn't, been with someone in immigration detention, like who was on a hunger strike, basically figuring out how to support them to get out before they died. or, like working with bereaved and survivors of the Grenfell Tower fire whose lives just have been ruined by state and corporate negligence, and for whom, there are some people for whom there just will be no resolution of that. And so I suppose, the thing that hasn't necessarily been in the conversation, like we kind of mentioned it briefly at the beginning, just is the kind of depth and the scale of the violence that, that we have to look straight into. And so, I suppose for me, that idea about utopia, so it comes from that place of day to day, trying to figure out how can we take the edges off this violence, and how can I protect my family from it, and how can I also not have to deal with it in my day to day. Like, that is the water in which we're swimming when we're thinking about utopia. And I think that's like a very different context to, if, we'd, I don't know, both just done degrees and then gone and sat in the library forever and we're just, you know what I mean? Like, it's a different place that it comes from. And the same as if, I don't know, I just like had a really gilded career in think tanks always and then was going on about utopia. So I think that like that kind of relationship to, like, there's always a relationship to doing, and I kind of don't ever want to like be someone who writes books and talks about them for a living and like has no contact with the work that I've always done. So my utopias are always basically like springing up from the hellscape in which we live, and that for me is why it's so important.
Yeah, when you were talking about, the right are always able to state their dreams as if they can be realities, like the fundamental difference between Priti Patel being like, so we're going to do this Rwanda plan thing, versus you writing like a political, like dystopian book is, and I think about the work and the writings of Dean Spade when he talks about mutual aid, that it's not the work that we're doing, whether it's mutual aid, whether it's writing dystopia, whatever the thing is, it's not just about, for example, in the case of mutual aid, like getting together to ensure that we can survive. It is that, but it's that underpinned by a shared understanding that the crises that we're facing are produced and compounded by these systems that we're living under. So it's about doing the thing, but as Gracie says, it also being underpinned by this like radical, revolutionary political base that is fully aware of, as you say, the hellscape that we're trying to spring up out of.
On that note, is there any questions? I think someone is coming with a mic. Is that right, JJ?
Stand up. I don't know if I'll be able to stretch.
Hey, I just have a question on like abolition and housing. So you mentioned like renters' unions, and I'm quite heavily involved in living rent and do a lot of research around housing. And I don't think it's often there's much of an intersection. I don't think housing is often a key focus in kind of some of the discussions around abolition. But I guess like housing is a kind of key area of like exploitation. If you think of like the likes of like Serco, who own kind of asylum seeker housing complexes, but it's also a key site of like resistance. But often, I guess in the housing movement, a big demand is the return of like council housing and public housing, which I guess then has a heavier involvement from the state as well. So I'm just wondering if either of you have ever like thought through kind of how kind of housing maps onto abolition, and
Yeah, maybe not kind of talking specifically to your point about council housing and the relationship to the state. I think that's a really important one. It's not particularly the field that I work in. I think about housing a lot because the day-to-day work that I do is, as Nish said at the beginning, like working with families who have no recourse to public funds, who are struggling with or facing being forced to endure homelessness and destitution. And I think it ties in really specifically to abolition, because a lot of what abolition is trying to do is to indicate the places where harm is happening and think about how we reduce that harm. And the state produces a lot of the sites of harm in society. Thinking about the fact that the people that are thrown into prison and disposed of, in many cases, the driving factor of a lot of things that become criminalized are things like poverty, not having somewhere safe to live, particularly with the people that I work with when we're thinking about domestic violence and how that intersects with the border regime. A lot of the ways in which the site of harm and exploitation is expanded is because people who have no recourse to public funds, who are in a situation of domestic violence, cannot say to the state, okay, I'm homeless, I need somewhere to live, I need to leave this relationship, I need to go and live somewhere else, because they may be financially dependent on the person that they're living with, their immigration status may be dependent on them, they may be undocumented and actually in every other way are therefore dependent on this person that is providing housing. So I think it's a really important thing, and I agree with you that it needs to be tied up much more consistently. The question of the way that borders become tied into the issue of housing, whether it's right to rent, so this policy that came in under the hostile environment in 2014 or 2016, which made it criminal offence to rent a property to somebody who doesn't have the right to rent because they're undocumented. These are the ways in which we see, the state crossing into and borders crossing into housing, which is such a fundamental, not even right, like a fundamental need. Like everybody needs a safe and comfortable place to live. So thank you for bringing that question. I know I didn't answer the specific thing about council housing, but it's a really important one.
I mean, I think there's a really important intersection, I think, specifically around housing and immigration. Leah's just mentioned right to rent, but also in terms of like who gets blamed for there not being enough housing. And I think that switched on housing campaigners will be able to say, well, it's landlords and rich people of all nationalities who are hoarding housing. And I think it's really important that that argument is front and center in anyone's kind of campaign around housing, because otherwise you're just going to get co-opted or inadvertently support the argument that migrants are coming over here and taking all the housing. I think it's really important to be aware, Leah's just mentioned right to rent, which is basically around criminalizing landlords for renting to undocumented people. Joint Council for the Welfare of Immigrants did, amazing research, like mystery shopper exercises, and took litigation against the right to rent policy, which found that policy was causing discrimination against racialized people of all immigration statuses. And any government that perpetuates that is therefore happy for that to be the case for people, no matter their immigration status. Like, that has to be a core of the argument. But I suppose I'm thinking again about Grenfell, because I think there were different kinds of tenancy in Grenfell Tower, but the landlord of that tower was the Kensington and Chelsea Tenant Management Organisation, which was contracted by the council to manage the block, manage people's tenancies, manage the refurbishment of the tower, which is obviously, why the fire happened, because the tower was clad in flammable cladding. And so I think that, we can't, abolition is about the abolition of policing in all our social relations. And like Dorothy Roberts, for example, talks about how policing happens within social services and the family welfare system. Policing happens within housing provision as well, right? And when you look at the attitudes that underpinned the neglect, not just the neglect, but the outright dismissal of people living in Grenfell Tower who were asking, what are you putting on this tower? What are you cladding it in? What is the cladding made of? Why are you putting it on the tower? Is it safe? Like, residents were asking all of these questions, and the attitude of the council was essentially that, they were adversarial and not worthy of response, right? 72 people died completely avoidably because of the attitudes of the council, like an organ of the state, wealthiest borough in London. So I think in a way, not that you're making this argument, but it kind of comes back to what I was saying earlier about climate policy, where everyone's just like, just get the government to do the right policies and it would be great for everyone. It's like, well, no, actually. And part of why Grenfell happened was because these were working class people, because they were disproportionately from migrant backgrounds, like because they were people that were treated as not important and not and as disposable. And so you can have all the council housing you like, and if you maintain the relations that we saw in Kensington and Chelsea, there will be more Grenfells, right? It doesn't, like, it solves the issue of people having a roof over their heads. It doesn't solve the issue of whether or not they're safe. Yeah, and building on the framework that Gracie talks about in the book around non-reformist reforms, like council, let's imagine there's a world where, the council housing stock is replenished. If we still have immigration restrictions and border controls and the no recourse to public funds condition, all of the people that I work with, they wouldn't be able to access those council houses anyway. So the point that Gracie and Luke make in their book, which is really important, is we have to, do the thing of starting at the margins and moving to the centre. It must be about what is the housing that is needed by the people who are at the sharp edge of state violence. Let's start there and then expand it out, rather than siloing off particular categories of people of like, okay, we're going to have council housing, and if you have recourse to public funds, and if you, fit within the particular categories of housing that makes you eligible for it, which leaves often out a lot of like single men, for example. If you have children or other requirements, it makes you more eligible for housing. So rather than thinking in these small silos and cherry-picking these groups of people that are going to be able to access the housing, thinking about housing as a thing that we all need, and actually, what is the quality of that council housing? We know that a lot of temporary accommodation is absolutely abysmal. There was the story, I think, a couple of years ago of the young toddler who died because of black mold in the property. So it's not just a question of replenishing the housing stock, but making sure that everybody has housing, and that housing is of a really appropriate quality, and it's not going to have flammable cladding on it where people are going to die because the local authority are trying to cut corners and cut costs. I think it's that much bigger picture that we have to start from.
Thank you. Are there any more questions?
Thank you. Don't worry if this isn't a question that you can't answer, because I know this isn't your specialism, but on talking about climate change and then not pushing for the government to kind of have more powers and make the policies that will fix it, what do we do to make the enormous changes that are needed? But again, I know that's a big question.
Yeah. No, it is a big question. I did run a climate organisation for a year. I ran Friends of the Earth Scotland for a year and did their strategy. It's not that I think there obviously, there has to be a role for the state, but I think the issue is the climate sector is, because it's white and middle class, is not understanding what the state is like. That is my fundamental problem. And I think, I remember there was one member who, put a motion to the membership who was saying, we need to be on a war footing. And I was just like, well, what does a war footing... It's in the exception that rights are completely trampled and that things are really bad for people that have less power, like when governments are like, well, there's a crisis and we just had to do what we had to do. And I think it's not that fundamental failure to understand that when governments are, mandated to expend loads and loads of resources really, really quickly, without consultation, without power actually shifting to the people that are at the sharpest end, that's when you get egregious overreaches, and that's also when you get so-called solutions that don't work for everyone. So I think my call to the climate sector is please develop your analysis of the state and think about the worst case scenarios, because what is going to happen is that, the climate crisis is happening. The responses are and will continue to be carceral. I know that the book's a bit controversial, but if you read Zaytoun about the state response in America to Hurricane Katrina, they managed to build a prison. They managed to build a makeshift prison before they'd figured out whether everybody was safe or not. like, when we haven't spoken about Palestine, and I don't want this to be a glib kind of, what's happening in Palestine will happen to all of it. Like, it's not as simple as that, and it shouldn't be a footnote. But the reality is, like, states are developing their capacity to cage people, to immobilize them, to cut them off from what they need, to make them less inconvenient. Like, states are not developing their capacity to, like, care for en masse or shift power to or radically resource. Like, so I think that is my frustration with the climate sector, is that there's just this very good faith, as Leah talks about extensively when it comes to a lot of the mainstream gender-based violence organizations. It's just like, the state is benign. The state is here to look after us. People have good experiences of the state, so they will fix this big problem. And also no problematization, really, of the role of states. Like, I guess there's this narrative in the climate sector that states are failing to act. And it's like, well, they're not just failing to act, they're acting to perpetuate. And there's a real naivety around, the way it's talked about. It's not, this is a broad brush. Like, there are people who get it. But the problem as it's put to, like, the general public that needs to be mobilized is governments don't understand the strength of feeling, and they need a mandate to act faster and further. There is not a conversation around, like, are states actually green-lighting North Sea oil and gas and blah, 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 and, like, why are they so close to the corporations that stand to profit? Like, that is not the mainstream narrative of the climate movement, and it's just really naive. It's naive and it's frustrating.
I think also in Scotland you also got the idea that somehow if we get Scottish independence, then we can solve everything. And I think that the climate movement definitely falls into that. At least a lot of the think tank reports that come out of, like, how we're going to do climate change within Scotland often end at, like, not talking about the rest of the world, which kind of is a bit weird, but that's just my experience. Does anyone else have a question? I think there was one back over there as well.
Hi, thank you so much for speaking to us and sharing your experiences and bringing the books to life as well. I have a question around archives, because I just chaired a panel about archives. But I'm also really interested in some of the archives that you explored, Leah, in your book. And the question is around, is there something archival that you have engaged with or referenced that you feel like we can learn something in regards to abolition now, or if it's something that has inspired you in general for both of you? Thank you.
Yeah, I think my book is very much that process of looking back to work forwards, and I think that often is a really useful pathway. There was one thing that I came across when I was researching the book, which, like, maybe shouldn't be surprising, but when I'm talking about carceral feminism, so this kind of neoliberal idea that, the state and police and prisons are going to solve gender-based violence, and that's the way forward. When I'm talking about this issue with lots of different people, often a piece of information that can be quite a light bulb moment is the fact that the first women police officers were former suffragettes. So there was a very short step between, and obviously suffragette is like a broad church. There was, like, the East London Federation of Suffragettes who were doing, like, cool socialist stuff, and then there were, like, the Pankhursts who were, bourgeois women wanting a seat around the table, and, like, that's a broad church. But that idea that the demand within the mainstream, like, high ranks of suffragette organizing was, we want a seat around the table, we want to be here as lawmakers, not lawbreakers. There's a short step between that and the idea that, if the police were just women, then everything would be better. And that is what one of the suffragettes wrote in her memoir. The reason why she wanted to become one of the first women police officers was she was brutalized by police, thrown in and out of prison, subjected to the Cat and Mouse Act, force-fed. And she had this reflection where she was like, I had these horrible experiences, and I just thought, like, this would have been better if the officer was a woman. And it's this really weird logic where you're kind of following and you're like, yes, I get this, maybe I understand where this is going, and then you're like, you lost me there at the end. But I think that is a useful historical detail that raises the fact that if your organizing isn't underpinned by a radical revolutionary demand to really change and improve things for everyone, it's going to take you down this very neoliberal, reformist, harmful path.
I often don't think of myself as someone who's been in archives, and then, your question, I was like, oh, yes, I have. So I used to work at Liberty. I ran the policy team and then was director for a year. And Liberty is Civil Liberties Pressure Group, and it has this enormous policy archive. And just going back to our discussion before about disciplining of the imagination, the way we made policy at Liberty, figured out how we would respond to new things vaccine passports or something, was by going through the old policy and sort of seeing what principles had underpinned that. So I used to spend all this time in the policy drive, which was an archive. And it was just really interesting, when I talk about imaginative disciplining, that happened within the organization. And actually, I basically just discovered all these really radical policies because the organization, as with many, really similarly to the kind of histories that you unearth in your book, it used to be a membership organization that was very grassroots, only had a couple of paid staff, and the policy was pretty radical. Liberty had opposed the entire 1971 Immigration Act, which is the foundation of our modern immigration legislation. It had been trans-inclusive since the 90s, sex worker inclusive since the 90s. And these were little bits of history that had kind of been allowed to be forgotten or had been actively suppressed within the organizational memory. So, that was an archive that was really fun and interesting to be in. And I suppose the other archive, which, this is ancient history for me now, but I did my undergrad in French and philosophy. I did it at Oxford. There's this beautiful modern languages library in Oxford called the Taylorian, and all the French African literature is in the basement in the rolling stacks. And actually that was fine by me because it's the only warm place in the whole library, and there was never anybody there. And rolling stacks are just really it was a really magical place. And there were copies of the minutes of this conference called Présence Africaine, which was, union, not a union, it was this gathering of African nations thinking, in that moment or in that era of independence movements in the 50s and 60s, you had people who were poets and politicians and writers, people like Aimé Césaire, people like Leopold Sédar Senghor, all of these really interesting titanic figures, they were all in this place at once. And the minutes of that conference were just, down in the rolling stacks in the basement. And that was kind of, I'd done kind of solidarity work outside of the university before I got to university, but that French African literature paper, that was my introduction to Césaire and to Fanon and to just, all of these non-Western ways of thinking about what can the world be.
Also, while you're sorting out the cable, there was another thing that I came across when you're talking about minutes of meetings. That's actually one of my favorite things to look at in archives, because I feel it's something right now there may be on Crabgrass or different softwares or Google Docs or whatever, and I kind of worry, thinking about archiving, how much of the content of those meetings are we really going to collect and hold and remember. And there were some minutes of a meeting by the Brixton Black Women's Group, and they were, for a long time, fiercely very opposed to taking any kind of state funding. And then they have this one meeting where they're right, the GLC, the Greater London Committee, has said they're going to give us some money, and they have this big debate of shall we take it or shall we not? And in the end, they decide to take it. But there's this one little footnote where it's Olive Morris wants it minuted that she does not agree with this. She does not want this to happen. And they do it anyway, but I really like that record of the messiness and the disputes and doing something where you're, moving towards maybe being complicit in state activity and you're feeling weird about it. But the importance of that being documented so we can look back and say, okay, we're having these struggles right now, they were having them back then, and we can be in conversation. There's a dialogue there about what can we learn and how can we move forwards in a different way. And I love those little kind of fragments and moments.
So I wanted to ask about the point that you made very early in the conversation about dismantling without rebuilding new systems. So I'm obviously from the U.S. We just had our election, and our president-elect has basically threatened to do away with many of the departments of our government. And so to me, that sounded like dismantling without leaving anything behind to maintain the community. I guess my question is, if you could write what needs to happen now and in the next few years, what steps would you suggest?
Thank you for your question. I won't speak to the specific US context because I'm not based there, and I don't want to talk about a context I'm not super fluent in. But I was in the US recently, and I was speaking with a professor who's based there, Calvin John Smiley, and he's written a book called Defund, which is really interesting, a series of conversations about this issue of defunding the police and just talking with different organizers and activists and different people in community spaces about what this is and what it could mean. And he talks about defund being a bridge between, a moment where the police are funded in the US and thinking about what would a future look like where they're not. And there's one essay in the book where he speaks with someone who was based at the time in the UK, and the issue of defund maybe not mapping exactly in the same way onto a UK context. When you're talking about dismantling different state departments, there's a question of, number one, the police in the UK, because of 1.5 decades of austerity, being up until quite recently kind of defunded anyway. But if you were to, for example, defund or dismantle the police or a particular department, if you leave everything intact as it is, that money is just going to get siphoned into some other harmful activity, right? So if the police in the UK were to be defunded and the current or previous government were to continue just doing what they're doing, that money would find a way to continue doing that harmful, it would shapeshift, right? It would continue doing the harmful, surveilling, harassing, brutalizing thing in a different way. And that's exactly what we saw when money was previously taken from the police, that they just kind of took different shapes and expanded their operations in different ways and popped up in different intelligence departments and did different things. So it doesn't really answer your question, but I think I agree with your concern around this dismantling with nothing else happening. It doesn't reassure us that we're moving in a positive direction, I don't think.
So like Leah, the States isn't my context, though. My mum is American. I have found, my family are living this in Philadelphia and New York and New Jersey. I think my general reflection on the context that I know right now, and having looked at the US election from afar, the phrase that keeps coming back to me is the only way out is through. And I think that, again, looking back at the Corbyn moment, I think that there was this kind of misguided belief on the left that if we just seized the organs of power, we could shortcut the need to actually build with and build a base. It was just we'll just have the machinery and then everything would be fine. And I don't think that organising to win the next election, that isn't going to cut it. I mean, for my sins, I am I do love policy. I think it's really interesting. And I am what is the progressive equivalent of Project 2025? Why does it not already exist? There are people working in silos who do have interesting, ambitious, far-reaching policy ideas, and have quite fine-grained workups of like how they can be implemented, like that there is not a coherent, cohesive vision, and there's like no conversation with anyone publicly about what that could be and what that could look like. And I think that there's going to have to be loads of firefighting, but there does have to be like this much capacity at least that is kept back for what is the like where do we actually want to go? So that's kind of one bit of my thinking. And then otherwise, it's got to, it will involve reformist and non-reformist tactics just to blunt the edges of the violence that is coming. Like when we think about what happened last time, just the need for the ACLU to be saying, get the kids out of cages, we can be as critical as we like about lawyers and certain NGOs, etc., but those organizations are going to be absolutely pivotal to blunting the edges of what is coming, and they need resources, and they also need pressure so that they do things right and don't do things in an annoying way or a way that's going to not stand us in good stead further down the line. So there's that aspect of things, and then there's just the very material, what is needed in communities for people to weather what is coming. I have followed for a while the work of Cooperation Jackson, who are essentially this really fascinating community cooperative that will not do projects on land that they do not own. And I'm not going to summarize it well, but they do community farming, it's an economy of food sovereignty within the US on land that they own for the people that live there, by and for the people that live there. It's going to take a lot of things like that as well. And also just a lot of I feel again, when I look at Corbyn, when I think about my own leadership of organizations, I just think that there needs to be, maybe this is controversial, but some real ruthlessness. It can't just be idealism. When you look at what the right does and how they fight, how they've weaponized the Supreme Court, how they've weaponized the filibuster, there is, then the progressives are going to actually need to just be willing to do that, right? They're going to need to be willing to do whatever it takes to take the edges off what is coming, and not be punching left and punching center, that's what the stakes are. But as I say, that's me from here. I'm not on the ground.
Thank you.
I think that's all the time we have for today. So huge thanks to Gracie and Leah as well for... I think the book signing is over there, so if you should read both, all of these books. And I think, there'll be a table there where both Leah and Gracie will be signing books. Also, thank you for coming today, and also thank you for Lighthouse for always organising amazing events.